Koukoulekidis. The first talk this morning on statistical mechanics with your Wigner activity.
People don't hear you online. You have to speak to the microphone.
Okay.
The one over there.
Well, let's add this to chairs.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate it's the morning session after the RAMP session. Most of the people must have thought the conference is over. But I'm Nick. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London, and today I'd like to discuss general constraints on magic distillation protocols that we derive based on statistical mechanics of Wigner negativity. Well, the clicker was working a second ago. So yeah, first I will give a refresher of the phase-space representation of quantum mechanics and how this is relevant to magic in the context of quantum computing. Then I will introduce our framework, our statistical mechanical framework, which is applicable on general quasi-probability distributions. And then within this framework, I will discuss how free energy-like thermodynamic bounds on distillation rates for magic arise naturally and are powerful enough to beat previously defined bounds in the literature. And this is all before concluding and leaving you with some open questions. So recently there has been rapid progress towards experimental implementation of fault tolerance. For example, we heard the talk by Google 2 days ago, and the leading framework to achieve fault tolerant quantum computing is the stabilizer codes, and mainly the surface code, where we can implement Clifford gates transversally. However, the Clifford gates in this context are not universal. Therefore, we need some way around this. A prominent way to circumvent this consideration is the magic state injection model, where we inject magic states into our Cliffords and stabilizer circuits to achieve universality. And magic states are non-stabilizer states which can work well with Cliffords. They can promote them into a universal gate set. So before discussing about magic state distillation, I will first discuss the phase-space representations for quantum mechanics. And in principle, when we have a quantum state in the Hilbert space picture, we can express it with a quasi-probability distribution in general on a phase space. And we can do this by decomposing our quantum state into a Hermitian operator basis, which we can call set of phase operators. And the coefficients in front of those operators form the distribution of the state, which in general is a quasi-probability distribution. This is familiar to us maybe from quantum optics, where we have the continuous Wigner function. And the negativities that appear in this Wigner function are an indicator of non-classicality. So completely analogously, in discrete systems, we can have a phase space. And here I've drawn the 3x3 grid that represents a Q-treat phase space. And I depict the Wigner function of a Q-treat magic state known as a strain state. And the negativity that appears here in one element of this function is an indicator of magic. This is true in general for odd dimensional systems, but not true in general for qubits and even dimensions. So my talk will focus on odd dimensional systems, and in the end I will discuss an extension of our results to qubits. So the phase space picture is important for magic in the context of quantum computing, because, for example, most prominently, the Clifford group gets a really nice representation on the phase space. Specifically, the Clifford group induces symplectic affine transformations. So I depict this here with an example. If we start with a Wigner function of a stabilizer state, the Hadamard gate, which is a Clifford operation, would simply perform a rotation on the phase space, a symplectic rotation, and the phase space would perform a translation. And these symplectic rotations with the translations are basically the symplectic affine group on the phase space. However, more generally, any quantum channel admits a representation on the phase space as a transition matrix. And the transition matrix for a channel is defined in terms of the state distribution for the choice state of the channel that we want to represent in the phase space. And it is defined in such a way that a quantum state transformation in the Hilbert space picture results in a state distribution update, where the update transition matrix corresponds to the quantum channel that performs the state transformation. And magic distillation protocols in general do not induce negativity, Wigner negativity themselves, and therefore they're represented by stochastic processes in general on the phase space. Where stochasticity is a superset of the transformations of the symplectic affine transformations on the phase space. And therefore, we can view magic states as states that result in the stochastic processing of Wigner negativity on the phase space. Now, these magic states and the negativity that they have in their Wigner representation is necessary if we want to achieve universal quantum computing in the magic state injection model. Therefore, we raise the question of whether universality via the magic state injection model admits a statistical mechanical description on the phase space. And we answer this question positively by introducing a thermodynamic perspective on magic protocols in general, where we view the magic protocol as a thermodynamic engine, with fuel being many noisy magic states. And of course, the useful output will be fewer high quality, low noise magic states. The apparent obstacle in establishing such a perspective is that the Boltzmann entropy is not well defined on quasi-probability distributions, because the argument in the logarithm cannot be negative for the Boltzmann entropy to be well defined. But we're able to circumvent this obstacle and establish analogs between core concepts in classical thermodynamics and magic theory. So our first result is the introduction of a well-defined statistical mechanical framework for general quasi-probability distributions, where entropies can be defined and be meaningful as well. Within this framework, universal quantum computing via the magic state injection model can be seen as the stochastic processing of non-classical free energy in the phase space. And with this perspective, we can see that the upper bounds on distillation rates for magic protocols arise naturally, and they take the form of thermodynamic laws, and they're powerful enough to beat previously defined bounds based on monotones, on magic monotones. So since the Boltzmann entropy is not well defined on quasi-probability distributions, we need to take a step back and consider more primitive tools in the realm of classical thermodynamics, which go by the name of majorization. And here I give the definition of a relative majorization ordering between pairs of states. And P and P prime are our system's state distributions before and after the thermodynamic transformation we want to perform. And R and R prime are the state distributions of some reference system we choose to consider alongside. And this ordering is defined as the simultaneous stochastic update of the system and the reference state distributions by the same stochastic matrix A. Now, majorization gives rise to entropies and relative entropies. And I also here give the definition of the alpha Reni divergence in the simple classical thermodynamic scenario. And what we do is we are able to extend majorization as well as the definition of alpha Reni divergences and entropies into quasi-probability distributions, W and W prime for our system instead of P and P prime. So these entropies are well defined and meaningful in the sense that they satisfy the expected data processing inequality whenever we have an ordering between the pairs of distributions. And here we require that, well, we can extend to quasi-probability distributions for the first argument of the relative entropy. And the reference system should correspond to probability distributions on the phase space. And the price we need to pay to extend to quasi-probability distributions turns out to be that we need to restrict the values of the index alpha for our divergences from the real positives, which is the common thing in classical thermodynamics, to a dense subset of the real positives. So firstly, we need to restrict to rational numbers that take the form of an even integer over an odd integer in order for the alpha rank divergences to be well defined so that the terms inside the logarithm are always positive. We further require that alpha is greater than 1 so that the monotonicity condition holds for the well-defined divergence that we have. And the monotonicity condition holds. The reason for this I outline here. Firstly, we introduced the alpha Renyi entropy instead of relative entropy, which can be expressed in terms of the relative entropy itself. And the alpha Renyi entropy is still Schur concave even on quasi-probability distributions by considering this Schur-Ostrowski condition on the ordering of the partial derivatives. And then we can use an embedding function in order to define, to express the alpha Renyi divergence in terms of a constant minus the alpha Renyi entropy of the embedded version of our quasi-probability distribution on a larger space, where the embedding function is defined with respect to our reference system. And because we have a minus in front of a Schur concave function, we basically get Schur convexity of the divergence with respect to the quasi-probability distribution W, and we retrieve the theorem statement. Now we get some immediate computationally relevant results from this framework. Firstly, mana is a magic measure, monotone, defined to capture the negativity of the Wigner distribution of states. And we see that mana is simply the residue of the alpha Renyi entropy at alpha equals 1. So mana quantifies the deviation of the alpha Renyi entropy from the limiting Boltzmann entropy in our quasi-probability framework. An immediate corollary of that is that for any quantum state, Wigner negativity and negativity in the alpha Renyi entropy of a state are equivalent notions. In other words, the state distribution for any quantum state attains a negative value on the phase space if and only if there exists an alpha Renyi entropy for the state distribution that itself attains a negative value. So we have well-defined entropies that follow meaningful data processing inequalities that also attain meaningful negative values in this framework. That is an indicator of computational power. So now with this framework, equipped with this framework, we can turn our attention to magic state distillation. And this is an important process because magic states can only be introduced as noisy states on the surface code and generally on stabilizer codes. Well, if we restrict it to two-dimensional versions of them. And therefore, we require a protocol that takes many noisy magic states and outputs fewer, less noisy magic states. And we can define the distillation rate of the protocol as the number of output states we get over the number of input states we put, which can be thought of as an indicator of the efficiency of the protocol we have. Now, a fundamental question we might ask is how good of a distillation rate we can possibly have. In other words, can we provide a theoretical upper bound on the distillation rate R? And the common way to tackle this question is by using magic monotones. And magic monotones do a very good job in capturing the properties of the input and output magic states in the protocol, but we can go one step further using our framework because we consider relative orderings that allow us to choose a reference process. We can exploit these reference processes to derive bounds that take them into account as well as the magic states. So these reference processes that we can consider in the ordering, which is going to be used to derive the bounds, can be viewed as a variational parameterization of our bounds, firstly, from an abstract point of view, where we vary the input stabilizer state in the reference process, and we see what optimizes our bounds. They can also be viewed as a way to incorporate generic protocols features like its symmetries or fixed points. So this would be features of the magic protocol, but in principle, we could also use the reference process to capture the real hardware limitations of the device we're using to perform the magic distillation protocol. And as a stretch test, we could think of a device that is really bad and outputs always the maximum mixed state, and this would be reflected in our bounds without considering the protocol itself or the magic states alone, as the magic monotones would do. Now, in our way of establishing analogs between classical thermodynamics and magic protocols, we can use this majorization ordering to extract some second law type restrictions on the impossibility of magic state conversions. Since this majorization ordering results from a stochastic, so from the study of stochastic processes on the phase space, which are a superset of the symplectic affine structure that Cliffords correspond to, we're able to get upper bounds on the magic distillation rate as an indication of how well we can possibly do given any magic distillation protocol. So the rigorous statement we have is, given any magic state distillation with distillation rate R, we can choose a reference process which converts a full rank stabilizer into another stabilizer under the action of the magic protocol. Then we can derive an infinite family of upper bounds on the distillation rate R. And these upper bounds take the form of ratios between alpha Rayleigh divergences, where in the numerator the divergence is considered between the input system and reference states, and in the denominator the divergence is considered between the output system and reference states. And these bounds are parameterized by the index alpha, which is restricted into our dense subset of the positive reals, as well as by the reference state, which converts the stabilizer states we consider. Firstly, I would like to demonstrate that our bounds are powerful compared to previous bounds. So we consider the strain state purification process as our distillation example. And we consider it under quantum channels that preserve the maximally mixed state. We show that the three bounds that are derived from our framework are tighter than the bounds derived by the magic monotones of Mana and Thamma Max, which are monotones in the literature. And therefore, we have some bounds that can be more tight. And in fact, we have shown analytically that our bounds are always more tighter than bounds derived from Mana, independently of the distillation process or the channels we choose to consider. Now, I would like to give also an example of how our bounds can explicitly capture physical characteristics, not only characteristics from the magic states. So here I'm considering the same distillation process under thermal operations. So that would be magic protocols that are also thermal operations in that they preserve a given thermal state defined by temperature and Hamiltonian. And then our bounds incorporate the noise levels of the input and output magic states, which are computational quantities. So far, so good. But they also incorporate the physical temperature and free energy of the thermal state that is preserved, as well as intermediate quantities, phi prime, which quantify the overlap between the computational and the Hamiltonian eigenbases. Therefore, our bounds reflect the temperature, for example, as I plot here. Now, so far, I've discussed odd-dimensional systems, but we're able to extend our results to qubits. And the apparent obstacle in doing so is that stabilizer states possess negativity necessarily, no matter the Wigner representation we choose. However, so therefore we can think that negativity is not an indicator of computational advantage in qubit systems. However, this is not important in establishing our framework. The core idea we're using is that we can represent the channels which describe the magic protocols stochastically on the phase space. Therefore, what we are able to do in work that we're currently having in our group is restrict to a subset of qubits and a subset of qubit operators, namely rebits and CSS completely preserving operations, that are sufficient for universal quantum computing. And we show that within this framework of universal qubit computation, CSS completely preserving operations admit a stochastic representation on some qubit phase space. Therefore, our results are directly extendable to qubits. And in fact, we have managed to obtain upper bounds on distillation rates for qubits that outperform, again, mana and the magic monotone of generalized robustness, which is a recent monotone. So simply, I would like to finish with some unexplored open questions. So I've discussed the direction towards how to implement our results to qubits, which is practically quite interesting. But from also a practical point of view, one could ask how we can assess our bounds in terms of real-world architectures. So our bounds are able to capture, in principle, hardware limitations and features of the magic protocol themselves. So the question we want to ask is, given a desired distillation rate, can our bounds really exclude achieving this distillation rate based on the hardware limitations that the architecture we have at hand presents? From a more fundamental point of view, we would like to ask what features of single-shot entropies could extend to quasi-probability distributions. For example, it is not clear to me if there is a notion of a central limit theorem, since quasi-probability distributions do not possess the property of typicality. And another interesting direction is using variants of majorization in order to derive lower bounds on magic distillation protocols. So we're able to derive upper bounds because we consider stochastic transformations on the phase space, which are a superset of the symplectic affine physical transformations corresponding to Clifford operations. However, one could consider a subset, a subgroup of the symplectic affine transformations and derive lower bounds on magic distillation by not considering any explicit distillation protocol at all. And some work on majorization variants that take into account some interesting subgroups of symplectic affine transformations, or more generally, group majorization is studied in the mathematical literature. So it'd be interesting to extend it into physics. And it would also be interesting because the next question I have written down is, well, our framework may also find applicability in other scenarios where negativity is an indicator of non-classicality, not necessarily magic. For example, perhaps in the continuous regime of quantum optics, if we can establish a reasonable notion of continuous majorization, for example, in this scenario. Thank you.
I guess I have a question regarding the definition you mentioned about relative entropies extended for the quasi-problem, right? Not only just relative entropies, but the alpha rate. Is this the first time it has been introduced in literature? Are you aware of anywhere else with this?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other literature that extends the definitions to quasi-probability distributions, but I'll be very happy to be corrected by someone more knowledgeable in the audience. I think it is a fresh approach.
Is there any reason why you pick the alpha rate rather than any other? Any entropies? Like you could have, for example, picked the sandwich, right? Is there any specific reason for this? For this specific pick?
Yeah, alpha any entropies arise naturally from relative majorization ordering considerations. So the monotonicity is basically based on the ordering that we have, as in the theorem statement.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thanks for a nice talk. I can actually address the question that came up. So Shin Wang and I had a paper called Alpha Logarithmic Negativity. And we took the alpha norm, which is used for sandwiched memory relative entropy. And because it's a norm, you can put a Hermitian operator for the first argument, and then for the classical case, you can have negative values. And that should be helpful. I mean, you said you were choosing values that are dense in the reals, but still this would allow you to get it for all reals. So we can talk about it more after.
Yes, thank you for mentioning.
Yeah, there's an online question I think maybe might be related by Stephen Fender. He is asking, can you extend the alpha to any real alpha greater than 1 by continuity?
So the problem with we have to be. I just don't know if it's my mic or no, we cannot extend to any real by continuity because we cannot have it is not a continuous function in alpha basically, and it is actually not well defined for positive values greater than 1 that do not take this form, rational numbers of even over odd. Rational numbers are well known to be quite pathological in their extensions. And this relates, I'll be more specific, this relates to if you have negativity, a negative value in these W components, then a different exponent would give just crazy jumps in the function and wouldn't make it well defined. I hope this answers the question.
You have some Wigner as the physical role that reference
The reference process that we would use. It is usually the case that the magic protocol we have at hand would instruct us a certain reference process, which is not necessarily the optimal one. However, for example, in the qubit case, we consider CSS preserving protocols, and these have a particularly simple action at the maximally mixed state. Therefore, the reference process in our considerations involves inputting the maximally mixed state and taking the output. So this gives a nice form in the bounds we have, for example. But it is not necessarily optimal, and I'm not sure how to find the optimal one in an easy, clean, efficient way. Mm-hmm.
Usually when you're establishing down functionality to the actual protocol, the one that's used, kind of see how different. And in this case, your reference state is the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you repeat the question beyond an audience can because the answer.
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry. Well, that question was whether we have some intuition on the choice of the reference process in the derivation of our bounds. The answer was that, just briefly mentioning it, that we can be instructed the reference process from the protocol itself, but it's not necessarily the optimal one. Go take everything off.